Girl makes strange hand signal in restaurant. When Millionaire realizes the reason, he calls 911. Before continuing, write below where you are watching from and what time it is. In the heart of a bustling city, nestled among towering glass skyscrapers, stood an elegant restaurant named Solstice. Renowned for its impeccable cuisine and serene ambience, it was where the city's elite gathered for both business and leisure. The golden hour light filtered through the restaurant's floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm glow over the sleek, modern decor. Crystal chandeliers shimmered faintly, lending a touch of opulence to the scene. At a corner table, Maria sat with her father. The girl, no older than 12, had large, doe-like eyes that darted nervously around the room. Her father, a stern man in his mid-40s with a crisp suit and an air of authority, barely glanced at her, engrossed instead in his phone. Maria's small hands fidgeted on the linen-draped table, occasionally forming gestures that seemed out of place, quick, deliberate, and almost mechanical. A few tables away sat Morgan Thorne, a self-made millionaire in his early 30s. With a successful tech startup under his belt and a charitable foundation to his name, Morgan was the epitome of the modern philanthropist. Known for his keen observational skills, he was dining alone, scanning his surroundings with casual interest. Morgan's gaze settled on Maria. Something about her demeanor, the tension in her small shoulders, the urgency in her movements, caught his attention. For a moment, he dismissed it, but then her hand signaled again, subtle and deliberate, forming what seemed like a pattern. His brow furrowed. Was it a game? A nervous tic? Or something far more sinister? Maria's father was a stark contrast to her timid energy. While she barely touched her plate, he gestured briskly at the waiter, demanding more wine and dismissing the dessert menu. His voice was clipped, his tone devoid of warmth. The way he ignored Maria's soft attempts to speak added to the air of unease. Maria's gestures became more deliberate. She brushed her hair behind her ear, glanced briefly at Morgan, then clasped her hands in front of her, fingers subtly curling into shapes. She repeated it twice, almost imperceptibly. To the untrained eye, it might seem like an idle fidget, but Morgan's instinct told him otherwise. He had spent years analyzing patterns and data. This wasn't random. The girl's eyes met his, just for a moment. It was fleeting, but enough to send a chill down Morgan's spine. Her gaze carried a silent plea, a depth of fear that struck him to his core. As Morgan contemplated whether to intervene or dismiss his growing concern, Maria's father barked an order to the waiter, drawing attention briefly to their table. Maria flinched, shrinking in her seat as her father leaned back, checking his watch with an air of impatience. Morgan's mind raced. Was he misinterpreting the situation? Overreacting? But as Maria shifted again, her hand brushing the edge of the table in a subtle, repeated motion, the pieces began to fall into place. She wasn't just signaling. She was asking for help. Morgan's heart pounded as he leaned back in his chair, his mind sharpening to focus on Maria's behavior. He noticed more details now, the nervous tapping of her fingers on the table, the way her eyes darted to the restaurant's exit and then to the other diners, searching for something or someone. Her father, however, remained oblivious, engrossed in his phone and swirling his glass of red wine as if the world beyond his screen barely existed. Maria attempted another signal. She raised her hand to adjust her hair, her fingers curling into the same shapes as before. This time Morgan was certain. It wasn't random. The hand signals seemed too deliberate, too specific. He strained to recall something he'd seen once online, an article or a video, about how children were taught to use certain gestures to silently communicate distress. The subtle signals paired with her father's cold demeanor painted an unsettling picture. Maria was clearly uncomfortable. Her slight flinches every time her father shifted in his seat added to the unease. Yet she stayed silent, never once raising her voice or calling for help. Morgan's instincts kicked in. As a man who had built his career on intuition and observation, he knew better than to ignore the signs. However, there was a fine line between stepping in to help and overstepping boundaries. He couldn't afford to make a false move. A waiter passed by, and Morgan caught his attention. "Excuse me," he murmured, his tone light but purposeful. "Can you get me a refill?" The waiter nodded, but Morgan's real motive was to subtly watch Maria and her father from a closer angle. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly falling into place, but time was slipping away. As Morgan discreetly observed the scene, he felt the tension in the air thicken. Maria's movements grew increasingly frantic, though still subtle enough to avoid her father's notice. She tilted her glass forward, spilling a bit of water onto the table. The man shot her a sharp glare, but didn't react further. She muttered a soft apology, her voice barely audible over the hum of conversation in the restaurant. Morgan decided to act, but cautiously. Pulling out his phone, he typed a message to a close friend, Amanda, who worked in social services. "I'm at Solstice. I think there's a child signaling for help. What should I do without escalating?" He hit send and immediately received a reply. "If you suspect she's in danger, alert someone. Watch for specific signs." "What is she signaling?" Morgan described the gestures, fingers curling into specific shapes, repeated motions, and fleeting glances for acknowledgement. Amanda's reply was chilling. "It's a distress signal. Do not approach the man. Alert authorities now." The knot in Morgan's stomach tightened. The waiter returned with his refill, and Morgan used the moment to speak in a low voice. "Can you get the manager?" "Quietly. It's important." The waiter's eyebrows lifted in mild surprise, but he nodded and slipped away without a word. Meanwhile, Morgan kept his eyes on Maria. She had noticed his interest, and there was a flicker of relief in her expression, but it was fleeting. Her father had started to notice her nervousness. Morgan's heart raced as the stakes grew higher. He had to find a way to intervene without putting the girl or himself in harm's way. Morgan's mind churned as he formulated his next move. He couldn't confront the man directly. That would risk escalating the situation and putting Maria in immediate danger. He also couldn't leave the restaurant without ensuring that Maria was safe. The burden of responsibility pressed heavily on him, yet he knew he needed to act decisively. The manager, a composed woman in her late 40s named Linda, approached Morgan's table. She leaned down slightly, her demeanor calm and professional. "Sir, is everything all right?" she asked in a low voice, her eyes searching his for clues. Morgan nodded subtly toward Maria's table. "The girl with the man over there," he whispered. "I believe she's signaling for help. Her gestures match a known distress signal, and she looks terrified. I've already contacted someone in social services, and they advised calling the authorities." Linda's expression shifted from polite concern to sharp alertness. She glanced discreetly toward Maria's table, her gaze lingering for a moment before she looked back at Morgan. "Are you certain?" she asked, her tone grave but steady. "I'm not certain about everything," Morgan admitted, "but I'm certain enough to know this can't be ignored." Linda straightened, her professionalism intact but her concern evident. "I'll handle it. Stay where you are, and keep an eye on them. I'll notify security and call the police." Morgan watched as Linda walked briskly toward the back of the restaurant. His pulse quickened as he returned his attention to Maria and her father. The man was now watching Maria more intently, a slight frown creasing his face. He seemed to sense her growing unease. Time was running out, and every second felt like a lifetime. Moments later, Morgan noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Linda reappeared, accompanied by a plainclothes security officer who blended seamlessly into the restaurant's environment. They moved with practiced discretion, avoiding drawing attention to Maria's table. Maria's hands were trembling now as she clutched the edge of the table. Her father leaned toward her, his voice low and stern, though Morgan couldn't make out the words. Her eyes darted to Morgan once more, this time longer, more deliberate. Linda approached Maria's table under the guise of routine service. "Good evening," she said warmly, addressing the man. "I hope everything is to your satisfaction. Would you mind stepping aside for a moment? There's a minor issue we need to clarify about your reservation." The man's expression darkened. "What kind of issue?" he asked, his tone clipped. "Just a procedural matter," Linda replied smoothly. "It won't take more than a moment." As the man hesitated, Maria seized the opportunity. Please, she whispered, her voice trembling, barely loud enough to hear.
He's not supposed to have me.
I want my mom. Her words hit Morgan like a jolt of electricity. There it was, the confirmation he had dreaded yet needed. The girl was not safe, and her fear was palpable. The man's head whipped around, his eyes narrowing as he registered her words. His hand moved toward her arm, but Linda stepped in quickly. Sir, please, if you'd follow me, she said firmly, her professional veneer masking the growing tension. Maria's disclosure had changed everything. The stakes had never been higher. Linda led the man toward the restaurant's front desk under the pretense of addressing the reservation issue. Meanwhile, the security officer approached Maria's table, crouching slightly to speak to her in a gentle, reassuring tone. It's okay, the officer said softly. You're safe now. Can you tell me your name? Maria hesitated, her eyes flicking toward her father, who was now engaged in a terse conversation with Linda at the front of the restaurant. She finally whispered, Maria. That's good, Maria, the officer replied. We're going to make sure you're okay. Is there someone you want us to call? Your mom, maybes? Maria nodded quickly, her eyes filling with tears. Please call my mom. She doesn't know I'm here. He took me. Morgan's chest tightened as he overheard the exchange. He felt an overwhelming mix of relief and urgency. Linda returned a moment later, signaling subtly to the officer. The police are on their way, she murmured. Morgan couldn't sit still any longer. He approached Maria's table, his voice calm and reassuring. Hey, Maria. I'm Morgan. I noticed your signals earlier. You were really brave. Her eyes locked onto his, wide with a mix of fear and gratitude. You saw me? I did, Morgan said gently. And we're going to make sure you're safe. Suddenly, there was a commotion at the front of the restaurant. Maria's father had realized something was wrong. His voice rose, sharp and angry, as he gestured toward Maria's table. The tension in the room snapped taut. Maria's father's voice cut through the calm ambience of the restaurant, his tone loud and accusing. What is going on here? He demanded, his gaze darting toward Maria. This is ridiculous. She's my daughter. She's fine. Linda, maintaining her composure, tried to de-escalate. Sir, please lower your voice. There's no need for a scene. We're simply ensuring everything is in order. But his demeanor shifted from indignation to alarm. He could sense that something more was unfolding. His eyes landed on the security officer standing near Maria and then on Morgan, who remained close to her, a protective presence. Maria shrank into her chair, clutching the edge of the table as if to ground herself. The security officer stepped forward, his stance calm but authoritative. Sir, please return to the front desk. We need to wait for authorities to arrive to clarify custody. At the mention of the authorities, the man's face turned red, his hands curling into fists. This is absurd. I'm her father. You can't just detain me without cause. His voice had grown loud enough to draw the attention of other diners, who whispered amongst themselves, their curious gazes now fixed on the unfolding drama. Maria's breathing quickened, her body trembling. Morgan crouched beside her, lowering his voice to a whisper. Maria, it's okay. He can't hurt you. Just stay calm. Suddenly, Maria's father took a step toward the table, his movements sharp and threatening. The security officer intervened, stepping between him and Maria. Sir, stay where you are, he said firmly. The tension hit its peak as the sound of police sirens faintly reached the restaurant. Maria's father froze, realizing he was running out of options. The restaurant's atmosphere had turned electric with tension. The police arrived moments later, their presence an immediate signal that this ordeal was far from ordinary. Two officers entered swiftly but calmly, their professional demeanor immediately taking control of the situation. The lead officer approached Linda, who quickly filled them in on the details. Maria's father, now visibly agitated, began protesting loudly. This is a misunderstanding. She's my daughter. I have custody. The officer didn't flinch. We'll verify that, sir. For now, we need you to step aside. While one officer addressed the man, The other knelt beside Maria. Hi there, sweetheart. My name is Officer Daniels. You're not in trouble, okay? We're here to help you. Can you tell me if you're hurt? Maria shook her head, her lips trembling. I just want my mom, she whispered. That's exactly what we'll do, Officer Daniels assured her, offering a comforting smile. He glanced at Morgan. Are you the one who noticed something was wrong? Morgan nodded. She was signaling for help. I couldn't ignore it. The officer gave him a brief nod of gratitude. You did the right thing. Meanwhile, Maria's father had grown increasingly erratic. This is insane, he bellowed, his movements agitated as the other officer attempted to calm him. You can't just take her away from me. Linda discreetly handed Maria's details to the officers, including the information she had managed to gather about her mother. The restaurant staff worked seamlessly, ensuring Maria remained out of her father's reach. The situation seemed to be under control until Maria's father made a desperate move. Without warning, Maria's father lunged toward her, pushing past the officer who had been addressing him. His sudden aggression sent a ripple of shock through the restaurant. Maria, he shouted, his voice laced with desperation and fury. The move startled everyone, but the officer nearest to him reacted instantly, intercepting the man before he could reach the table. Chairs scraped against the floor as nearby diners recoiled in fear. The officer wrestled him back, but his resistance was fierce. Maria let out a small cry, clutching Morgan's arm as if holding on for dear life. Morgan wrapped an arm around her shoulder protectively, his voice steady despite his racing heart. You're okay, Maria. They've got him. But the struggle wasn't over. The man broke free momentarily, his determination bordering on madness. She's my daughter, he yelled, his eyes wild. You can't take her from me. It was a tense and chaotic moment. The officers moved quickly, one restraining him with practiced precision while the other held firm to keep him from reaching Maria. For a brief second, it felt as though the situation might spiral further out of control. Then the officer managed to secure him, pinning him down and snapping handcuffs onto his wrists. The man struggled but eventually stilled, his protests now desperate and incoherent. The restaurant erupted into quiet murmurs as the tension began to deflate. Maria buried her face in Morgan's shoulder, tears streaming down her cheeks. The nightmare was nearly over, but the emotional toll lingered in the air like a heavy fog. The officers escorted Maria's father out of the restaurant, his shouts fading into the distance as the police vehicle doors slammed shut. The tension in the air began to dissipate, though the murmurs of curious diners persisted. Maria's small frame shook as she sobbed quietly into Morgan's shoulder. He stayed still, letting her cry, his presence steady and comforting. Officer Daniels returned to Maria's side. Maria, he said softly, crouching to her eye level, we've contacted your mother. She's on her way to the station now. Would you like to come with us, so she can meet you there? Maria sniffled and looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. Yes, please, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The officer smiled gently. That's a brave girl. Let's get you somewhere safe, okay? Morgan knelt beside her, his tone warm and reassuring. You're going to be okay now, Maria. You were so brave tonight, and you did the right thing. Maria wiped her tears with the back of her hand, a faint flicker of gratitude crossing her face. Thank you, she murmured. As the officers escorted Maria out of the restaurant, Morgan watched her go, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief. Yet, he couldn't shake the tension that lingered in his chest. For all the fear and danger of the night, Maria was safe now. That was what mattered most. Linda approached him with a grateful smile. You saved that girl tonight, she said. Not everyone would have noticed. Morgan nodded quietly, the weight of the night still sinking in. I just did what anyone should do. Hours later, at the police station, Maria's mother arrived, her face a mixture of panic and relief. As soon as she saw her daughter, she dropped to her knees, wrapping Maria in a fierce embrace. Tears streamed down both their faces as they clung to each other, their reunion a poignant moment of pure love and relief. I was so scared, Maria whispered into her mother's shoulder. I thought I'd never see you again. Her mother stroked her hair, her own voice thick with emotion. "You're safe now. I'll never let anything like this happen again. I promise." The officers gave them a moment, standing respectfully nearby. Maria's mother looked up, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, addressing both the officers and Morgan, who had stayed at the station to ensure Maria's well-being. "I don't know how to thank you for saving my daughter." Morgan gave her a small, humble smile. "Maria saved herself. She's incredibly brave. I just noticed." The mother hugged him briefly, her gratitude palpable. Maria glanced at him shyly, her lips curving into a small but genuine smile. "Thank you," she whispered again. As Morgan left the station that night, the weight of the experience settled into his bones. It had been a harrowing evening, but seeing Maria reunited with her mother filled him with a profound sense of hope. The next morning, Morgan sat by his window with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over the city. The events of the previous night replayed in his mind, every detail vivid and haunting. He thought of Maria's trembling hands, her desperate signals, and her quiet courage. He couldn't help but reflect on how easily he could have missed the signs. How many others might have ignored the subtle plea for help, dismissing it as the idle movements of a nervous child. The thought left him unsettled, but it also strengthened his resolve. Later that day, Morgan drafted a blog post for his foundation's website, sharing the story, not the details of Maria's experience, but the importance of recognizing signs of distress. He included links to resources, videos, and guides on how to identify and respond to silent cries for help. "We all have a responsibility to look out for one another," he wrote. "Sometimes, the smallest actions can save a life." As he hit publish, Morgan felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. The world could be a dark and unpredictable place, but moments like these reminded him that courage, vigilance, and kindness could make all the difference. Far across the city, Maria woke up in her mother's arms, safe and loved. The nightmare was over, and a new chapter of hope had begun for them both.